What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content that I'm uploading onto my channel, then feel free to subscribe, and you can also offer suggestions on topics and characters and storylines and whatnot that we can have discussions on later on in this channel. So I don't normally do videos like this. I really leave this more to like emergency also because that's kind of his whole thing, but Charlie, I'm stealing your format for today. But the whole reason behind this is because of the fact that the Logan film looks like it's going to be amazing. And I've had these thoughts rattling around in my head for a little while, and so I figured I'd go ahead and throw them out there. But the big question that I think everybody has going into this movie is, where are all the mutants? What happened to all the mutants? Because we know in the trailer, at least from the trailer we saw, that from what Wolverine says, there's no more mutants anymore. And so the question is, where did they all go? Now, this creates kind of an interesting scenario because there's really only two possibilities, at least in my mind, there's really only two possibilities as to why. They're both equally possible, but one's more interesting than the other. So to the less interesting one, to start that out with, it's really just kind of like a statement made by Emma Frost. In the original Old Man Logan story, Emma Frost had made this statement that mutants were just a blip on the radar, that mutants were not the future of humanity. Like, they weren't leading a new wave of evolution. It was just for a few generations, people were born with the X gene with mutant powers, and then nobody was born with mutant powers after that. Now, that begs the question, did the story House of M happen in the Old Man Logan universe? Did the Scarlet Witch change reality and then set it back and say no more mutants, and then it was just a permanent effect? Is that what happened? Or within the context of the main story from Marvel Comics House of M, when the Scarlet Witch made her statement and it sent a shockwave throughout the multiverse, was the Old Man Logan universe one of the universes that was affected, and there were no more mutants born just because of her actions affecting the entirety of the multiverse? Creates some really interesting questions, but that was really what happened, in the Old Man Logan story. It was just mutants were a blip on the radar, that was it, and there were no more mutants being born going into the Old Man Logan story. That one's not very interesting. What is interesting is the legacy virus, and I love the legacy virus concept. But the best way to think about it is that there were three types of the legacy virus. There was legacy 1, 2, and 3. Legacy 1 was great storytelling. Legacy 2 was a plot device, and legacy 3 was, we got to wrap this up. So when it came to legacy, really the legacy virus itself, the concept, it was basically a Marvel Comics stand-in for like HIV/AIDS. Is really all it was. I mean, by 1994, HIV/AIDS had kind of reached prominence in terms of the number of people who were dying because of it. The social reaction to it. I'm not going to make this a political video, not at all. But comic books usually always try to stay topical. They always try to engage themselves in ongoing themes. And the reason why is because it allows them to tap into audiences that wouldn't normally read their comics. And so if the HIV/AIDS pandemic is just kind of creating this whole social storm, this whole social uproar, and then suddenly Marvel Comics has something called the legacy virus, which is basically the same thing as AIDS, people might be more inclined to read that. And so within the comic book line, legacy virus really appeared at like the very end of Executioner Song. And Executioner Song was this 15-issue story arc. It was nuts. That was ridiculously convoluted and insanely hard to understand. It was one of those really difficult stories to follow because in the 1990s, crossovers weren't as easy to follow as they are now. Marvel just kind of threw out a whole bunch of comics and it was left on you to put them in chronological order. But with regards to the legacy virus, what had happened is a villain named Strife, who was basically a clone of Cable from the future, had traveled back in time for the purpose of creating a gene war. And the idea was that some 2,000 years in the future, the villain Apocalypse had taken over the world. But because of the fact that Apocalypse had this extreme social Darwin viewpoint where he was like only the strongest deserved to survive, Apocalypse was working on a contagion that he would spread into the atmosphere and that only the strong would be able to survive. The weak, their bodies would simply just succumb to the illness and they would die. The problem was that Apocalypse was killed before the virus could be finished, and so Strife finished it off, came back to the present day, and released it onto the world. Now, with regards to what Legacy did, Legacy 1 was a fast-acting virus. It was really the most comic book version of AIDS that you could have seen at the time. Basically what happened is the legacy virus was an airborne illness. Not everyone contracted it, but those who did succumbed to a really terrible set of circumstances, but only if they were mutants. If a person contracted the legacy virus, the virus would go through their entire genome, and if it did not sense an X gene, which is to say the gene that gives mutants their powers, then the virus would just die off. But if it did pick up an X gene, if it did recognize an X gene, then the virus would kick in. And what it would do is it would basically block the creation of new and healthy cells, because your body creates, new cells all the time after old cells die off. It's just the natural function of your body. It's just how it works. Skin cells and hair cells, so on and so forth. What happens is the legacy virus says, okay, this person is a mutant. So basically when your cells die off, no new ones are being created. And it basically causes the body to break down on the genetic level until the point that you die. And it happens happens extremely fast. One of the most notable ways to do this was to kill the sister of Colossus, Illyana Rasputin. Now this has also allowed Marvel to kind of shake things up a bit, because when Illyana Rasputin died, it was a huge deal in Marvel Comics. People were like, oh my God, like Colossus' sister died? Holy cow. And even then, Marvel was able to write the story of Colossus in a way that he was crushed by the experience. The problem was that Marvel looked at the fan feedback to the death of Colossus' sister, the subsequent stories that they wrote, and how well it was received, and said, well, we could do something with this beyond just having an end comic book adaptation of AIDS. And that's where the plot device comes into play, and that's really where the legacy virus just kind of meandered on for almost a decade. What ended up happening is Marvel initiated the creation of something, or really kind of basically introduced something called Legacy 2. And what Legacy 2 did was the exact same thing as Legacy 1. It would block the creation of new cells. The difference is that along the way to your eventual death, your powers would flare out of control. Now, Legacy 2, as it was written in Marvel Comics, was the closest to the intention of Strife when he released the virus in the first place. He wanted to basically start a gene war. He wanted to create a war between humans and mutants, where humans would be terrified of mutants more so than they were before. And the reason why is because of the fact that if Legacy 2 caused mutants' powers to spiral out of control, then who knew what would happen? I mean, humanity would sit back and say, well, what would happen if like some mutant with telekinesis, that's infected with Legacy 2? What happened if they came walking up to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, lost control of their powers, and basically crushed the entire White House, and the entire White House collapsing in on itself? What would happen if some mutant with the ability to control reality lost control of their powers and destroyed all existence? Maybe not necessarily on that scale, but what would happen if like 50 mutants were hanging out at a mall one day and they all lost their powers? The loss of life would be insane, not to mention the property damage and so on and so forth. And so because of that, it basically reflected this normal society view of, the idea that humans hated mutants, and it amplified it even more, because now what started out as a fear of being replaced by mutants turned into a fear of being just wiped out by mutants that couldn't control their powers. And so it allowed Marvel to sort of go through and start, messing things around and adjusting a few things here and there. The problem is that in the midst of the storytelling involving Legacy 2, the comic bust of the 1990s took place. And so comic sales just started tanking at an astronomical rate. And so Marvel basically put Legacy 2 on the back burner and said, we don't really have time to flesh out this story. We're just trying to stay afloat. We're just trying to keep ourselves in business. And so what started out as a really, really cool concept just became like a reoccurring subplot in X-Men lines of stories. Now, this basically went on for quite some time, but we did get some cool stories out of it. For example, there was a story where a villain named Pyro basically wanted to spend his last few days being a good guy, where historically he was always a bad guy. And so it was kind of cool to see these, these mutants that were basically bad guys trying to find some measure of redemption. It was kind of cool to see those. We also saw things like Jamie Madrox. For years and years and years, Jamie Madrox, also known as Multiple Man, was believed to just kind of create these multiple versions of himself, and that was it. They were just replicas that existed out there. What the Legacy virus did is it allowed Marvel to come back and say, no. They're not just, soulless replicas. They're Jamie Madrox. They have their own identities. They have their own views, their own perceptions. They're effectively individual people. And so it was really cool because we never looked at his character like that before. Now, that helped to kind of rise the profile of Multiple Man for a little while. The issue was that he still kind of remained somewhat of an obscure character. But what ended up happening is going into the early 2000s, really into 2000 and 2001, Marvel was experiencing this huge shakeup. I mean, we've talked about this before. We talked about Joe Quesada coming on as editor-in-chief in my recent video on the origin of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We talked about Ike Perlmutter and Avi Arad coming on board and restructuring Marvel from the ground up. And so the idea was to basically wipe away all those things that just didn't really seem relevant anymore, or were basically just kind of taking up space. And the Legacy virus was one of those. Marvel sat down and said, this thing was introduced in 1993, 1994. It's just been hanging around ever since, and we've never done anything with it. And so what they did is they brought in Chris Claremont along with a handful of other writers and said, your job is to wrap up the Legacy virus. We don't care how you do it, just wrap it up. And so what we got was this sort of really just kind of like a contrived story, to be quite honest. What ended up happening is Marvel modified the Legacy virus yet again and gave us Legacy 3. The difference here is that Legacy 3 functioned almost identical to Legacies 1 and 2, but with the added benefit that it would affect anybody who contracted it, human or mutant. And so what this did is it basically allowed Marvel to kind of hit the panic button within their own universe, in the sense that, well, now if the Legacy virus can infect humans and mutants, well, now we've got to hurry up and we've got to find a cure for it. Otherwise, the entire population of humanity will be wiped out and humans will go extinct. And so what ended up happening is Marvel basically killed off a character named Moira McTaggart, who had really been a holdover for a couple decades. I mean, her relevance in comic books vanished as soon as X-Men the Animated Series came to an end. No one cared about her character. And so because of that, Marvel was like, she's throwaway, we can get rid of her. She was the one that more or less kind of laid the groundwork, laid the foundation for discovering a cure. The work that she had done was taken by the X-Men, it was examined by by Beast, but because of the fact that that Colossus had defected from the X-Men after the death of his sister Ileana due to Legacy 1, and because of the fact that he perceived himself as making a few mistakes here and there, he more or less operated as a martyr. And so what Marvel did is they had Colossus inject himself with the cure for the Legacy virus. He lost his life, but then the virus turned around and just went airborne, or I guess the cure went airborne and spread throughout the world, curing everybody. It was half thought out and it was poorly implemented. But it achieved the goal that Marvel was looking for. They were like, now the Legacy virus is gone. Now we don't have to worry about it anymore. And that kind of set the stage for things going after, but that's really all it was. I mean, in terms of the Logan film, I would say the Legacy virus is a pretty reasonable candidate for what's going on. The reason why is because if there's no more mutants that are there, we don't know why. We don't know if there's no more mutants because they're dead. We don't know if there's no more mutants because of the fact that they are not popping up anymore. We don't know if the illness that Charles Xavier has is the Legacy virus, and he's basically dying because of it. Because remember, as far as we know, the only two mutants that we're seeing right now are Charles Xavier and Wolverine. Now, as far as I'm aware, in Marvel Comics, they never addressed Wolverine's healing factor in relation to the Legacy virus. I'm not going to swear to that. And if you're really, really familiar with the Legacy virus line of stories, post a comment down below and let me know. But I don't believe Marvel ever squared that circle. In X-Men the Animated Series they did, but in the comics, I don't believe they did. And so we could easily look at this and say, well, Charles Xavier's not dying because he's old. Charles Xavier's dying because he has the Legacy virus. The Legacy virus is killing him. Wolverine doesn't contract it because he's got a healing factor. His body just continually fights it off and he'll be fine. That would make a lot of sense, to be quite honest. But I don't know if that's exactly what's going on in the film or not. It could just be that it's exactly what Emma Frost said in the Old Man Logan story, where it was just like, well, mutants are a blip on the radar and that's it. You know, and there's nothing else to it other than that. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained and you guys enjoy this video, make sure you hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys want to see more like this, then make sure you drop a like, and make sure you guys go check out Emergency Awesome too. I mean, I don't really know if it's necessary for him to get a shout out from me. His channel's almost twice my size, but it never hurts to let people go check out other YouTubers and be like, hey, go watch that guy's videos. But anyway, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end, and I will catch you all later. Peace.